What's up, guys? Welcome to another one. It's time for tennis. So I just thought this would be kind of an interesting conversation topic, but it's one of those things. If you ever start this conversation or you join on this kind of conversation, like on what is it called? Talk Tennis. I got banned from Talk Tennis actually for self-promoting, but I was kind of just waiting for that to happen because I'm not really trying to promote my channel, I guess, on Talk Tennis. But I figured while I'm there, I might as well. But I don't know. I'm not on there anymore. If anyone is from there and they followed my content because I was there, that's why I'm not posting anymore. So, and that's fine, actually. I kind of appreciate the engagement here more so than I do on Talk Tennis. But fun fact, anyway, this is just a stupid picture. Look at this. I looked up racket stringing because I wanted to show you guys a picture here, but it says every 6 months here on like WikiHow how to string a tennis racket. Every 6 months, dude, that triggered me. So I just wanted to say that. You should probably do it way more often than that. So what am I going to talk about today? So this is a better picture for something I wanted to talk about. So my I want to go over a topic and kind of my opinion on it, but I sort of have a soft opinion on this because I think it really depends on a lot of factors. But this is a factor that people don't really consider when it comes to string gauge and how it influences spin. So there's obviously a lot of conversation about there or out there about that, and there's so many different opinions and so many different points. And I think a lot of these different points have merit, or basically like this is true, but people don't really consider the circumstances in which it's true. For example, if you hit super hard, like your Nadal level top spin, I think if you're hitting with like say a 19 gauge string versus a 16 gauge string, I think if you're Nadal, you're going to get more spin with a 16 gauge string. So this is something that's probably already like wrong to a lot of people, but I want you guys to consider a couple things. So one of the things, and you can't really show this with a picture, so ignore this picture for this point, but you have to imagine, and it's good to think in extremes here. Imagine that there was like a 25 gauge string, right? So super, super thin, probably almost like dental floss level thin. People say that the thinner the gauge, the more spin you get, but how long is that true for, right? Like there's going to be a point that the string is so thin that you aren't really getting any spin anymore, right? Because either the string is too thin or it just has no like tension, right? Like you could string it really high, but it's so thin and so elastic that it really provides no power and no spin whatsoever, right? At what point does that become not true anymore? So how thin can you go with the gauge of string and still expect a higher return on spin, right? It's not forever. And that goes for things in the opposite direction too, right? People talk about thicker gauges giving you maybe more control and less feel. Some people think that thicker gauges give you more spin, and they argue that the mass of the strings is a large contributor to the spin effect. And I actually really side with that, right? So if a string, so you want to imagine the strings are snapping back. So if the strings have more mass, and you can talk about tension here, like strings under more tension will provide more spin, right? Like you could say that. I'm not necessarily saying that. I think it depends. But it's another thing too. Like if you string a string bed at 20 pounds, for example, which one is going to have more spin? The one at 20 pounds or the one at like 45 pounds, right? 45 is already kind of considered like low tension territory. So which one do you think would provide more spin? Because again, it's not true forever that lower tension equals more spin or more power. If you have a string bed strung at 5 pounds, are you going to get any power out of that? You're not. So what I think is actually true is that a thinner gauge string gives you easier access to spin, but I think the overall spin potential is lower. And I think that a lower tension string will give you easier access to power. But to an extent, the return on power is going to be a lot lower once you start hitting harder because those strings are only going to be able to return or deal with so much mass or so much energy because they're so thin or they're so low. So a lot of this stuff really depends on the level you play at, your play style, and how hard that you hit. And I think that people don't consider that as a factor when they're talking about these things, like all this conventional wisdom, like thicker gauge means this, thinner gauge means that, more tension means this, less tension means that. I really think every like the overall tennis community's belief on this stuff is just way is kind of it's so oversimplified that it kind of just ends up being wrong a lot of the time. And that's why I wanted to make this video. But here's one more consideration that I want you guys to think about. So it's the way in which they interlace. So look at the way that the strings, the crosses weave over the mains here. So I know it's a little bit blurred out of focus just because it's one of those kinds of pictures, but you guys know how this works. The crosses go through the mains, and there's sort of a weaving effect going on. And you have to understand that when the gauge is thinner, the little zigzag that you see right here, right? These little zigzags, these corners or whatever you want to call them, those zigzags are going to be much less pronounced the thinner your gauge of strings are, right? And you have to also imagine that on a thicker gauge string, having a sharper or higher edge on these intersections where the crosses and mains meet, having that be more pronounced is going to have an effect on how it bites into the ball, because those are kind of like rounded corners at every intersection point. So the thicker the gauge is, the more intense that little peak and valley is that's going on there. So you're going to get like a sharper edge on the string at that point. And I think that is also something that should be considered when you're considering, thickness and how that influences spin. So I picked this picture here because this is a cross string that is woven through, but it's obviously not tensioned. So I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to show you, is that a thicker gauge string is going to look a little bit more like this in a string bed, whereas a thinner gauge string is going to look a little bit more like this. So my personal belief is largely that whether or not these things are true, they're very circumstantially true. So I said it before, but I'll say it again real quick. I think that thinner gauge strings give you easier access to spin, but I think on the top end of things, a thicker gauge string will give you more return on spin, but it's harder to access because it takes more power and more skill to tap into that spin potential. So I think it's only truer that a lower tension and thinner gauge string will give you more spin potential. I think that's only true if your personal spin potential is actually below that of the threshold that would be more relevant to like thicker gauge strings. So that's where I think that is true, and I think it's important to understand like where these things actually are true or are not true. You got to again factor into the player level, really. So this is a kind of a conversation that does support the idea that it is kind of the player, not the racket, or the player, the strings. But I feel like that conversation and these points that I'm bringing up really never come up in the conversation when you are getting involved in them. If you see any forums, they just talk about that, but they don't really talk about why. They talk about like the thinner gauge biting into the felt of the ball more. But a lot of people get into the argument about snapback and texture too, right? And that's a very back and forth argument. I personally think both matter. And I think that a shaped string might compromise a bit on snapback, but the texture of it gives you more bite. So I wonder where the happy medium is. Sometimes I had the idea that getting a really slippery cross string in a shaped, not too aggressively shaped, but maybe some kind of rounded hexagon shape string or something would bite into the ball, and the crosses would allow that to still have a lot of snapback. But I also got the idea that a shaped string would eventually kind of wear out or round out where it's intersecting on the cross string, right? Because eventually, like, take like a triangular string or a square shaped string, eventually if the corners just rub and rub and rub on the crosses, those corners will get rounded out. And I thought maybe once that happens and they wear in again, they get a little more snapback or something like that. So I've had these ideas in my head, but I think both things matter. But I also feel like the strings that have really no texture to them and they're just perfectly round, I feel like I can kind of feel the ball kind of slipping in the string bed just before the strings really bite into it. And that's kind of been my experience. So I generally prefer a string in the mains at least to have some kind of texture, some kind of shape, because I do feel like that does affect the spin. So that's what I've noticed for my, for my on my end of things. Like that has been my experience, and that's why I believe them. And so for me, those things might be some illusion or some kind of placebo effect, but it also just might be true for me and it might not be true for other people. So that's why I wanted to have that conversation. I thought maybe it would be cool to bring up a few other points that are really rarely, if ever, talked about. So yeah, that's ultimately the point of this video, just to have some other things to consider when you are thinking about strings and spin and how to maximize that for yourself. So yeah, just let me know what you guys think of the video and the points that I brought up, and it'd be interesting to have a conversation about it. But yeah, anytime you get into this kind of thing on tennis or talk tennis or whatever, it's very quickly toxic, and I hope that doesn't happen in this comment section too. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. I made a little short talking about how I don't really care for my VCORE in the string bed that I have, and I have I have tier 1 Black Knight. I think I said Tour status in the short, but it's not. It's actually tier 1 Black Knight. And that was a string that I liked in my E zone because it really tamed the power. So that was like a 1619 very high power frame, and the power always kind of bugged me. I felt like I always had more than I needed most of the time. Um, but it was nice to have it when I had it, but there was so many times I just felt like, oh, it's too much. So I kept looking for strings and tensions to kind of tame that without making the racket too uncomfortable. So the Black Knight was a string that I really felt like gave me what I needed to get out of that racket, right? So, but now I'm using that in the VCORE 95, and I strung it at 49, and it's a 16 gauge string, and it's just surprisingly dead and uncomfortable, like really dead and uncomfortable. So it might just be the racket, but I also feel like maybe it's the strings because I think back to what I was looking to get out of the strings when I got them. So yeah, that was a good realization. So I'm gonna try some new strings, and just I wanted to start that conversation a little bit since I'm going to be looking for strings again a little bit. So I purchased some Confidential, and I also purchased some Y-Tex Quadro Twist, which is a string that's also another reference string for me that I'll talk about sometime. But I think they make it in 16L only, and it's super slippery. It does have kind of a gentle texture. It kind of looks like it has a spin, like sort of a rounded, maybe a square shape to it, but I don't actually think so. It kind of has like a diamond pattern that's indented into it that sort of looks like it's got a spin or a twist to it, but I don't think it actually does. If you look carefully, I think you'd agree. But that's not a string too many people see. I never hear it really talked about except on forums, but in person, it's all like Hyper G and a bunch of, Luxilon stuff and Solinko stuff. And then the occasional person that has like multi or sin gut in the crosses with something else. So, yeah. Anyway, just a little conversational point in a video I wanted to make since I'm thinking about getting strings and I opened up to ideas and string suggestions. So let me know what you think. If you guys have polyester strings that you think that I should try, let me know. I'm curious what's on your radar and curious what you guys want to know about. I do want to check out that company Toro line, so I'm going to reach out to them and see if they want to give me some strings. Until then, I will see you guys in the next video. So thanks for watching, and yeah, let me know what you think is like the largest contributing factor for spin, at least when it comes to the strings, because I made another video about how racket specs actually matter a lot, and that was a video about how twist weight relative to swing weight really matters when it comes to a racket's spin potential. So, all right, I will leave it at that for now. See you guys in the next one. Bye.